So, well, there's only 6 people here. I have to say, I was totally amused by the idea of, "Hey, how are you?" Now you went so fast, I missed the first couple of names. Fiji, how cool is that? Anyway, I was just saying, "Hey, Kristen, how are you?" And Michigan, yeah, it's beautiful. My daughter just sent me pictures of someplace they're camping there. I love the idea of me going to places and bringing a little item because I have been on the road for 8 months and I've been all these really cool places. But what should it be? Like a gnome, not a lobster. Don't suggest to me a lobster. Maine people are sick of lobsters. I think it's a great idea. I'm open to suggestions. I think that'd be totally fun. And yes, I'm off to Chicago this week. I'm going to the national convention. I'm really excited. This is for somebody like literally this is what I've spent my whole life studying. And somebody invited me. You don't just you can't just go, right? You have to be invited. And and somebody said, you might want to go for a day or two. I'm like, are you crazy? I want to go for every minute. I'm going to be the last person out of there. And they're like, but the speeches aren't that exciting during the middle of the days. I'm like, this is literally what I read for fun. So this will be great. Walpole, Massachusetts, Walpole woodworkers out there, South Carolina. I love that when people, oh, a lighthouse. That's a cool idea, Leslie. Yeah, drop idea phone, not in this chat because I don't tend to see these because of the way that it works on a video. But how can you get me? Not in the, yeah, throw them in this chat. I'll go back and look over them. All right, so let's get down to business here. Lots of things going on right now, and I'm going to start, and I'm going to be in a number of places. Look at my notes. But obviously you're concerned mostly at this point with the upcoming presidential election. And I have a lot to say about that and maybe some other things as well. As usual, let me start with the really easy things to knock off. Somebody asked if there was any chance the election would be postponed. I would say the answer to that is no. The United States feels really strongly about holding its elections on the prescribed dates. It means a lot more than simply holding that election on the date because it goes back at least to the Civil War when somebody recommended to Abraham Lincoln that he not hold the election in 1864 when it looked very much as if he was going to lose that election. And that would have meant coming up with some kind of a structured peace with the South would permit the construction of the Confederate States. And he said not to hold that election would already be an admission of defeat. So he insisted on holding it. And if you remember, in the summer of 2020, Trump repeatedly floated the idea of putting off the election. And it just didn't go anywhere because people recognized that would be just a huge departure from our norms. And so it went ahead then in 2020, even under the conditions of the pandemic. And I've not heard a single peep anywhere about anybody calling to postpone it now. So I would say that one was a pretty easy one to get rid of. But let's go right into let's go first into polls. People have asked what the polls look like these days after so many months of polls looking not great for the Democrats. The truth is that the polls are looking very, very good right now for the Democrats. But I would caution you about the polls now the same way I did before. Do not pay attention to the polls because polling has its own issues right now. And so does the use of polls by different campaigns. So certainly it looks as if the Harris-Walz ticket has got some real momentum behind it. But you will note that the only time I talk about polls is if I am trying to make a larger statement about the way the country sees something, or if I'm trying to make an observation about the way Americans feel about something, because issue polls tend to be pretty solid. Who's going to vote for whom polls just are not that solid. That's not to say they're all bad. I follow Tom Bonnier and Roger Solenberger, but don't don't lose sleep or gain sleep over polls in this particular election. All right. So that being said, there are some very important things going on, though, in with regard to the way people are perceiving this election. And one of the things to look for is former President Donald Trump's absolute obsession with the size of rallies. And the fact that he came out over the weekend, I think on Sunday, I don't remember which, and tried to argue that Vice President Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, were artificially inflating their numbers through the use of artificial intelligence. And that was much more than just Trump going off the deep end, although I'll talk more about that in a minute. That's also going on. That's that he is trying to build and has repeatedly tried to build in his runs for president, especially in 2020 and again in 2024, the idea that he couldn't possibly lose because of the size of his rallies. Now, the size of rallies doesn't really tell you a lot. I mean, I think in the case of Trump in 2016 and in the case of Eisenhower in 52 and in the case of Harris and Walz in 2024, they do indicate momentum, but because you go to a rally doesn't necessarily translate into votes. But Trump has really, really, really harped on the idea that the number of people at a rally translates into popularity in the vote. And so the fact that Walz and Harris are turning out, those were my notes. Who knows what you're going to get? I got them back. The window's open near me. The fact that those that they're turning out the kind of numbers they are at rallies is clearly upsetting Trump, because he's not turning that kind of people out. He's not getting that kind of enthusiasm. People are bored at his rallies. I don't know if you've seen them or watched them, but people are playing on their phones. They go on too long and so on. And what that does at a macro level, I mean, we can talk about Trump and I will talk more about Trump, but at a macro level, this momentum behind these rallies to Trump says that he can't convince people that he won, even if the numbers come in bad. So let me articulate that better than I just did. In 2020, if you remember, he made a huge deal about the fact he was out giving rallies and Biden was not, and because of the pandemic. And when the vote came in, he repeatedly said to people and tried to push the big lie that he had won by saying, look at all the people I had who turned out. Look at all the numbers I had. And I think what he's trying to do, and this has been clear for a long time now, is he is not trying to win the most votes. He is trying to convince people yet again in 2024, the way he tried to in 2020, that he won. He was the most popular candidate and the election was stolen from him. And the fact that Walz and Harris are turning out huge numbers, people are waiting in line for hours, they can't get big enough venues, that translates in people's minds to he's just not, Trump's just not that popular. And he's afraid he can't go on with the second plan that I think he's aiming for in 2024, which is to say, once again, that he won and he was cheated of the election. And by the way, of course, we know both from 2020 and before that this was not something he came up with after the vote was in. The idea that he was going to be cheated of victory was something he salted many months ahead of time. And he's doing the same thing in 2024. So that the polls don't, I mean, yes, the polls matter, but like I say, don't worry about the polls. And the enthusiasm behind Harris and Walz matters a lot. But I think if you step back and look at how incredibly upset he is about the rallies that Walz and Harris are putting together, I think that says something larger about his political strategy. And there are many ways in which he is trying to undermine that. But one of the ways is by saying, they're only doing this through AI. And we know that he does that. You must by now have seen images of him coming out of a room and is going, thank you. And there's the camera pans around and there's no one there. They will fill in those bodies later with AI, but there is no evidence that Harris has done that. And in fact, when charged with that, people who attended the rallies put up their own videos saying, I was there. Here's my crappy homemade phone video. And you can see it's not AI because I couldn't even hold it up right. Um, so I think that there's a larger story behind that is worth thinking about. People ask some questions about the stump speech that Harris is giving, that because it is virtually the same as she has given everywhere. And there's a couple of answers to that. The first is yes, that's called a stump speech, and they're pretty much the same all the time. And the reason for that is partly because it's easier than writing a speech. Just so you know, if I am going to give an hour-long speech that I don't care hugely about, it's a minimum of 10 hours work. If I do care about it, it's probably 4 to 5 days. So it's not easy to come up with a speech. It seems like it should be, and it's just not, because if you're really going to do it right, it's got to be crafted, and there's, all kinds of stuff has to happen to it. So it's just easier not to have to come up with a speech again and again. But there's another reason you do it. If you repeat the same things, people hear them, and you have to, anybody who's a teacher knows, that's on this call knows, you have to repeat something 3 times before your students hear it. And more is better. And the other reason that you want to do it is because it gives your brain a rest. I was demonstrating this the other day to somebody, and I said, and this will, if you've listened to me before, you know exactly what's coming next. Regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, promote infrastructure, protect civil rights, right? I work that into almost every speech. And when I do that, I don't have to think about it. I just say it. Or 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Obviously, usually I say that with a little more emphasis, but it kind of, if you're in a big room full of people and there's a lot of excitement and a lot of adrenaline, it gives your brain a little bit of a rest. All right, that being said, I don't do that. I think that anybody who has a basic stump speech should always put new material into it. Not much, but it's like somebody said, it's like going to hear your favorite musician. And while that's true, you go to hear the same songs again and again. You want something new in there. And I would like actually to see every politician do that. That being said, Trump also has a stump speech, and that's why he keeps going back to the shark and Hannibal Lecter and all that kind of stuff. So that's what's going on with the stump speeches. And again, I prefer to give a speech. And, if you've listened to me do the different events I do around the country, I basically say the same thing in different words, but I always bring something new. And I think that's kind of important to do, just my kind of thing there. All right. So, another question you asked is why, and this is a really important one, I think, why, actually, let me go to this one first. Why are Harris and Walz only appearing in swing states? And they're appearing, by the way, in swing states and states that have not previously been considered swing states, which suggests they're expanding the map. And that was not just Harris and Walz, by the way. The Biden campaign had pushed into states where it had not before been considered to be competitive because of the abortion issue. So states where abortion is on the ballot in terms of a constitutional referendum or in terms of protection of abortion rights, that will give Democrats a leg up because we know that abortion rights are popular, healthcare rights are popular, and that will bring people to the polls who might not otherwise have come to the polls. And if they are there, they will almost certainly vote Democratic. So why then the Harris campaign and Walz have been going to the swing states is partly to shore up the vote in those states. And that all comes back to the Electoral College, about which a number of you asked. And you asked if I like the Electoral College, and the answer is absolutely not. I was going to say, don't start me, but you did. So I'll keep on going with this. The Electoral College was established by the framers of the Constitution for a really good reason. And that's that in when they were writing the Constitution, there was very little communication across the states. And so it wouldn't be possible for voters in Georgia, for example, to have any idea who the leading men were in Massachusetts and vice versa. So what you do when you vote is you vote essentially for what at the time were considered leading men. Now that's not the way they do it any longer. The electors can, be appointed by the local Democratic committee or Republican committee or whatever. But the idea was that you would get these men at the time, they were all men, into a room, and they would compare notes. They would be worldly men, they would have traveled, they would be able to say, oh, yes, 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 I know Henry, sort of stuff. And that made a lot of sense in a time when we didn't have modern media. One, and two, it made a lot of sense at a time before we had steel frame construction. Because when we get steel frame construction in 1873, we get the ability to create really big cities. So until then, there were vast differences between the size of different areas, but nothing like we would get after 1873. So for example, the fact that Los Angeles or California with its major cities and Wyoming both have 2 senators, and that translates into 2 votes in the Electoral College, is bonkers. And then if you add to it the fact that in 1929, the House of Representatives capped its representation because they recognized that now there were more people living in cities than there were in the country. That also is a disadvantage to the more populous states. So that the Electoral College now means that, and there's one other big challenge for the Electoral College. When it was conceived of, when the framers conceived of it, they thought it would be representational. So if you lived in a state with, I'm going to go with 11 electors, and half of your people voted for one person and half voted for another, you would split those. One would get 6 and one would get 5. And what that would do is it would essentially just create another layer of representation in our system. But what happened was that in 1796, and honestly, this is one of the big reasons I really loathe Thomas Jefferson, only one, but one of them. Thomas Jefferson recognized that he would have won the election in 1796 if Virginia had not split its electoral vote. And Virginia had a really high electoral count in that year and in that period. And so he convinced in 1800, he convinced Virginia's electoral votes, delegates, electors, that's the word I want, to vote as a block. To say that if you get 51%, you get all the votes. And when that happened, other states felt like they had to follow suit so that their own homegrown people would stand a chance against whoever it was Virginia wanted. And so right now, all except the states of Maine and Nebraska have a winner-take-all system, which completely destroys the whole idea of having a free and fair representation, because what it means is that if you live in Massachusetts and you're a Republican, good luck with that. You're not going to have a say in the Electoral College. Or if you're in a Republican state and you're a Democrat, you're out of luck as well. And what that means then is that the people running for president tend only to campaign in the states whose votes swing. And while those states are very important, Pennsylvania, for example, is a very important state, the people who live in Pennsylvania are not more important than the people who live in California or in Mississippi or wherever. So do I like the Electoral College? No. Now there's the vote compact to try and get around the Electoral College. People have talked about throwing out the Electoral College. It's hard to do because most of the presidents who are elected thank the Electoral College for that, so they don't want to change it. But one of the things that I keep pressing for, at least as a prelude to getting rid of it, is to restore its representational nature. So as soon as Thomas Jefferson pulled that in 1800, James Madison was like, wait a minute here, you can't do this. And we have these papers in which he said, we've got to amend the Constitution so that you don't have winner take all, so that the Electoral College is representational. And that would be a start. So as well would the many different ways in which we could adjust the Electoral College more accurately to reflect actual population than it is now, because currently the Electoral College is made up of the number of senators and representatives in each state. And of course, that means that the really big states are badly underrepresented. And Danielle Allen, who's a legal scholar, has a number of has studied this and has come up with, I think, at least 4 and possibly more ways that we could adjust the numbers on the Electoral College to make them much more fair. And I know it frustrates the heck out of me. She writes in the Washington Post not infrequently, and I feel like nobody reads her because there'll be a column about Trump and it'll get 25 or 2,700 comments, and hers will get 117. And I'll be like, in the scheme of things here, we really should be reading Danielle Allen. But anyway, that's the story behind the Electoral College, and that's why. Oh, someone just said I didn't explain it well enough. All right, that's why why people campaign in the swing states, because those are the only ones that matter. It's not worth in the Electoral College, it's not worth to get you to 270, which is what you need to win. It's not worth campaigning in Mississippi, where you have a pretty good sense that it's going to go Republican, although not always. It wouldn't have to go that way. Or to campaign in Massachusetts for Trump. The chances are pretty good that Massachusetts's electoral votes are going to go to Harris and Walz, and that's why they do that. Now, something that is flashing by here that is worth pointing out. Yes, so every time we do a census, which is every 10 years according to the Constitution, the states, according to the population that they have in them, get either gain or lose representation. And that's why districting matters so much. And that's why the census matters so much. And the fact that under Trump, there was a real effort to undercount people in Democratic states is that's why that was such a big deal. And you can see that now in the fact that in this election, there is, because of the way that the redistricting was done, there is no longer a clear path to get to 270. You can get to 269, but not to 270 very easily, which is why Nebraska just went through that big thing trying to do its votes as winner take all. Didn't manage to do it. But the idea was they wanted to be able to put Trump over the top if, in fact, he takes Nebraska. That being said, one of the things that I was just talking here about the Electoral College, but somebody was just talking about Texas, Georgia, Florida. I'm not thinking off the top of my head of others, but states where the state legislatures are actively trying to get rid of voting, drop boxes, for example, or suppressing the vote. Those are states that rather than calling them red states or blue states, although the blue states don't really do this, you should think of them as voter suppression states. They would not be trying to take the vote away from Georgians in Fulton County or from Texans in the biggest county there, which tends to vote Democratic, or in Florida if the Republican-dominated legislatures thought that they could control the vote without taking that away. So it's there's a lot of flux going on here, especially in this election. All right, so now the question that you keep asking about is, that's the Electoral College, is what about the people who are threatening not to certify the election? All right, so I'm going to step back just a second here. I did talk about this last week. I'm happy to talk about it again. I've said all along that Trump was not trying to win the majority of the votes in this election. He does not have a ground game. When he put Lara Trump and Michael Whatley in as the head of the RNC and got rid of his own hand-picked chair, Ronna McDaniel, in the spring. Ronna McDaniel had a ground game. He got rid of it. And instead he said, no, we're going to take the money that you were putting into turning out voters and we're going to put it toward lawyers. That's what he has developed, is a team of lawyers who they believe will be able to contest the election. So how is this going to work? There's a number of different ways in which it will work. The one that I've been watching really closely, which seems to be less important now, was violence. And one of the things that, if you watch Trump in the winter, he kept trying to get people to turn out and create violence around his indictment, his trial, a trip of truckers to the border. He kept trying to get people whipped up and to turn out and to be violent. And so do some of his followers even still, especially those on the far right podcasts. But Steve Bannon, who liked to whip people up, is in prison. There are Alex Jones, to some degree, has been muzzled. That's been harder to do than it was in 2020. So what I was watching is the idea that he would try and whip people up to violence in the states around the time of the election, creating such muddiness it was not going to be easy to certify who had won the elections in certain states. Now, just a reminder, people keep asking about Vice President Kamala Harris being able to certify the vote as the president of the Senate in early 2025. Can she do that? And the answer is no. That position never certifies the vote. The votes are certified in the states, and the states do it in different ways. But it happens in the states. And then once the states have verified and certified that election, then it goes to the National Archivist, and the National Archivist makes a record of those votes, and then the votes are counted in that ceremony in front of the joint session of Congress. And so it's a ceremonial role. That's the role that Trump tried to turn into a functioning role under Pence, and Pence said, "I'm not getting my hands dirty with this," probably recognizing that if anybody went to prison over it, it would be him. And so vice presidents do this. George H.W. Bush did it for his own election. It does happen. But it's important to remember that ceremony does not certify the votes. And in fact, senators and representatives working together can challenge the counting. They can challenge that certification. In general, in the past, it was always simply a protest vote on one side or the other. In 2020, it became a thing for MAGA Republicans to try and overturn the election. And there's been a law put in place since that. But back to the certification in early 2025. So what I think has been the idea for the Trump people is to create such muddiness in that certification that it was not going to be possible for the Democrats, whom they expected would win the popular vote. Remember, Trump has never won a popular vote. Never, never, never. Never won a popular vote. Now, he managed to get the Electoral College in 2016 by about 44,000 votes spread over 3 swing states. He could not do that. He lost by about 2.5 million votes in 2016. He lost by about 7 million votes in 2020, and then it simply didn't happen. But I think the plan was to create such muddiness that it was not possible for the victorious Democrats to have enough certified votes to make it over that magic 270 number. And if that's the case, what happens, according to the Constitution, is the question. And by the way, all those people who wouldn't certify, that will be challenged in court. And this has been happening since 2020. And Mark Elias of Democracy Docket is one of the leading lawyers who challenges all these things. And he wins because this is BS, basically, right? There's all these systems in place to protect our vote. These people saying, oh, it's not fair. They lose. They always lose in court. But if you could mess it up long enough that the certification couldn't meet the deadlines it's supposed to meet, then you had the option perhaps to throw it into the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, according to the Constitution, each state gets a single vote. And if there are more Republican-dominated states than Democratic-dominated states, Trump could be elected based on that vote, and that would be constitutional. Barring that, you could send it to the Supreme Court, where there are the extremist judges that were put in place before Trump took office, and then the 3 since then, all of whom voted on July 1st, 2024, in Trump versus United States, to say that the president, and by that they meant Donald Trump, if you care, I can explain why, could not be indicted or prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his official duties. This is an overturning of everything that the American rule of law has stood for. So would they side illegally for Trump in a contested election? I'm afraid the answer to that must be assumed to be yes. All right. So what do you do aside from worrying? Because a lot of you are worrying. First of all, you make sure you're registered and all your friends are registered. But second of all, there are a number of organizations, including something called the States Project, to try to make sure that in states, especially in states where certification might be an issue, there are enough Democrats in state and local state legislatures and local offices that they won't pull this stuff. And so the place to be looking if you're concerned about this is at the state and the local elections, and to make sure that the election people going into office and the state legislatures, some of which were decided in the last election by fewer than 60 votes, have resources and people knocking on doors and everything they need to try and make sure that the people in place are people that you can trust to count the vote legitimately. If you can work with, if you are able to work at the polls, that's a great thing to do too. But this simply must be an all hands on deck push to make sure that the election deniers can't gum up the works in order to try and throw us into plan B, plan C, and so on. All right. So somebody just asked, isn't it time to expand the size of the House of Representatives? It would be well over 1,000 people if, in fact, it had continued to grow at the rate it did until 1929. There are, as I say, a number of different plans for making it far fairer than they are, and you should look at all of them because I do think this will be on the table going forward, simply because we can't continue to have a country where the majority is not represented. We have kind of gritted our teeth and put up with it for a long time, but it's not sustainable long term. All right. Couple more questions here that you asked. Why isn't Harris? Oh, so here we're going to get into some fun stuff. I think fun stuff. And then I'll try and hit some of the other things you asked. People asked why Harris doesn't talk to the press. And this is a fascinating question to me. You know, the press is known as the fourth estate because if you think about the way a democracy works, what is possible in a democracy is only what the people will accept. And the way that you convince people to accept things is by talking to them about what is possible, right? So in order for people to go along with something or not depends on press transparency, on the press telling people what's going on. But there's some really interesting stuff going on right now. So you must have a free press. You just must have a free press. And if you look at some place like Hungary, where Viktor Orban has said that people who don't agree with him are, misinforming the public, so he shut them down. That's the sort of thing you saw with Nixon, for example, with George W. Bush, who insisted that people who criticized his policies in the Middle East were anti-American. Trump certainly talked about the lying press, which came straight from Germany, the Nazis who talked about the lying press. And the fake news. That's an attempt to get rid of people's faith in the press. And that's a huge deal. I mean, one of the things about the press is that you simply have to have a free press in order to have a democracy. And that's recognized in the First Amendment to our Constitution, which protects the right of the press to speak. The government can't squish our press, which in some ways that's the scientific term for it. They can't squish it. But that in some ways has led to the United States to have some difficulties because it's harder in the United States to crack down on disinformation than it is in other countries that have a different form of protection of the press. So that's out there to begin with. All right. So we need that. We must have that. But there's some really interesting things going on with the press right now. And I have not understood them, but I think I'm finally getting a handle on them because one of the things that is very clear to me, and most people may not be aware of it, is that There are a number of different press corps around the country. And so, for example, the State Department gives a press conference every day. So does the Defense Department. You can see these, they're public. You can literally go and you can read the transcripts or you can watch them if you want to every day. And you can see what's happening with defense or with state. I'm not sure commerce is every day, but I mean, these people are out there. And what's really interesting is that the reporters at state and defense are fabulous. They're really good. And as in, they know their material, they ask really good questions. And by that, I mean, and I'm making this up, but somebody at defense might say, I understand that you have switched the number of widgets that is going to country X from 37 to 34. But that suggests that those 3 widgets that should have been part of the manifest that's going to country M are not going to be there, which is going to hurt country M's trade policy with regard to country X. Can you tell us how you're planning to make it possible that country X doesn't then have to go and invade country Q to get the material that, they're really complicated, really smart questions. And it's really striking how different the kinds of questions one hears shouted at the vice president or the president or Trump, or, well, not Trump so much. He doesn't really get questions, how different those questions are. And I have not been able to figure out why. And, I think maybe I've figured it out, maybe at least an idea for it. So until about 1960, that's the way that presidential campaigns were covered. The press traveled with the candidates on a train, for example, or on it could be in buses. In fact, let me tell you a great story. So Mamie Eisenhower traveled with Dwight Eisenhower in the 52 campaign. I think it was 52 campaign. It was the 52 campaign. And the press guys were all men. And they were kind of hard-bitten men. And there was one female reporter. And she and Mamie Eisenhower got to be somewhat friendly because they were both dealing with the men on the press train all the time. And so in the press car of the train, the men had pinned up girly pictures, of naked women all around the press. The press thing, which of course is enormously inappropriate and uncomfortable for the female press person, which didn't, the men didn't care. They thought it was funny, right? So one day the press woman gets sick and she can't go cover Eisenhower wherever she is. So she and Mamie Eisenhower spend the whole day cutting out bathing suits for the girly posters, and they glued them on so they could not be removed. And so when the guys all came back, all the women were clothed when they came back. And that's the way it had to be for the rest of the tour. I love that story. Anyway, they used to travel with the presidents, and they used to report on the speeches, on the policies, and so on. But that in 1960, a lot of things happened to the industry, if you will, of the presidency, as in the presidents, both Nixon and JFK, both start to use outside consultants who have a background in advertising, for example, and JFK starts to use polling as well to see what positions people want him to take. And at the same time that goes on, there is this journalist who is also a novelist, really great writer, and he has a lot of money because he's just sold a big story to Hollywood. And he also has just lost his job because he worked for Collier's magazine and it had gone under. And so he had some free time and he decided he wanted to write an epic story of the 1960 campaign. And he did. It became known as The Making of the President, 1960. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1962. And it completely transformed the way people covered political campaigns, because rather than reacting to what the politicians said in public and their position papers, he had backstage access to them all. And so, he would have sort of this novelistic approach to them eating breakfast, or how depressed they were about something that happened or how angry they got about something. And it became sort of this epic story about America that was not just about a campaign, it was about, the giant picture of American politics. And, in many ways, that changed the way we cover political campaigns by making the people covering political campaigns desperately want to get the inside story. They want to get, the secret scoop that nobody else is going to get. And what that has meant, I think, in our era is that it means that it's, you know, a great example of this is that people who were criticizing Harris for not talking to the media, even though she's barnstorming the country, she finally walked over to them on the tarmac in Detroit the other day and said, "Okay, what you got?" Every question they asked her was about Trump and something Trump had said. Now, if she had answered those, and she's basically put them off by saying, "I haven't listened, I don't know, whatever." If she'd answered those, she would have let Trump define her campaign and the national conversation. Like at that point, the reporters become part of the story, right? So, and the last question they asked is, when are you going to sit down for an interview? And what's interesting to me, not being a journalist, I'm not a journalist, I'm a historian, is that I don't want to scoop. I actively don't want scoops. I don't want someone to give me some secret information because I am trying to keep a public record. So what's interesting to me is Harris's policies are everywhere. You can't look away from that woman the same way you couldn't look away from Biden, and he didn't get any coverage either. That is, they're sending out stuff every single day. She gives speeches all the time. I mean, the speeches now are Stump speeches, but she has spoken all over this globe for 3.5 years. She's had um, uh, what's the word when she and foreign people go in front of the press? Press availabilities, I guess. I'm sorry, my brain is not going great here today. She did this. She's done big tours in all kinds of places around the globe in which she's been in front of journalists all the time. She's, so the amount of material that is available on her is reams and reams and reams and reams. Her office sends out, and this is not secret, you could be on this list if you wanted to be, and I do not recommend it because I am on these lists, and I probably get 50 to 100 notices a day. They send out press clippings, they send out information, they send out this and they send out that. That stuff is all available. And this idea that somehow you've got to ignore all that and just see if you can get the one scoop, it just seems to me to be an enormous disservice. This came to my attention when she went to Africa and went to 3 countries in Africa, and there was a ton of material available on those countries, how the United States is trying to interface with those countries, what the United States is trying to do in Africa compared to China and Russia. It's all this material, and virtually nobody covered it. I mean, I did, maybe 1 or 2 other people did it. A lot of members of the Black press did, but you're just not getting that kind of coverage. So one of the things that is interesting in this moment is that Trump provides that. You can go down, Trump will talk to you as long as you're willing to listen. What he won't do is answer questions, right? And he'll say whatever anybody wants to hear. So he's getting that kind of coverage. But Biden and Harris have really gone back, I think, to an older model where they will talk about policies. They will give you position papers. They will tell you what they have done. They will tell you what they're planning to do, but they won't do that sort of gotcha game. And I think it's a really interesting moment because I actually, being a historian, I like the policy papers. I like that. And again, if I had been able to shout a question to Harris in that moment, I would not have asked about Donald Trump. I would have asked what her changing policies were that day with regard to Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, very much up to a lot of stuff that is changing very, very quickly in Israel and the Middle East. And, that had nothing to do with Trump. That had to do with the administration. And I don't think she would have answered, but that at least would be something she ought to have a position on, and she ought to be able to say, well, take a look at whatever. Anyway, so that I think, I don't know, but I think that's why she's not talking to the press, because it's not a good use of her time when she can instead talk to people directly through social media and through these rallies. But also, the other piece here is that in the last 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, there's been an alternative press that has come up and is, in fact, covering this stuff pretty thoroughly. And it has a pretty big readership. And that is, I keep throwing out names here, but there are a lot of us that are not yet coalesced into new forms of media, but that are covering stuff in a lot of depth that you might not be getting elsewhere. And certainly there are still people in the legacy media that are doing the same thing. Now, one of the things actually on that front that I wanted to cover today that you didn't ask about, and that's because tomorrow is the anniversary of the signing of the Social Security Act in 1935. I did a kind of a deep dive today because the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting back and forth about whether or not the Republicans want to cut Social Security. And I actually spent some time on YouTube trying to figure out what people were saying about that, both what the parties have said, but also what how people have evaluated that. And it's really interesting because, near as I can tell, the real explainers are all from the radical right, which is a huge problem. And I know you've asked me to do explainers. I didn't realize how lopsided things were on YouTube. I gotta say. And maybe I'm not an expert on it. Maybe I just wasn't looking in the right place. But the explainers I saw were heavily weighted toward the Republicans, and they were very misleading. But it is an interesting question because this is one that it seems important to me for the press to sort of pull apart. And that is, the Republican Party has called for years now to cut back Social Security or to get rid of Social Security. And you remember, it's been a disaster for them. People don't like that. So the Democrats have continually protected Social Security because that's really popular, to protect Social Security. And what's interesting is that Vice President Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz are, speaking of stump speeches, by the way, I say that the first time to alert people to who they are, and then I try to go back to just shorthand, but there are some names I cannot say without that introducer. So you will never hear me say, I can't even do it. You will never hear me talk about this man without saying it this way: Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. It's very hard for me to say just Barry Goldwater because my mind just does the stump speech, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Anyway, Walz and Harris keep saying that the Republicans want to cut Social Security. And they have said or made it sound as if, they haven't actually said it, they have made it sound as if Project 2025 calls for cutting Social Security. And you will see this picked up in stories around the country. There's a wonderful write-up in an Arizona newspaper within the last several months on Social Security that says Project 2025 calls for a cut to Social Security. If it does, I could not find it. But let me explain what's going on. The Republicans have called for cutting Social Security now for decades. In March of this year, 2024, the Republican Study Committee, which is the House, basically most of the House, like about 80% of the members of the House of Representatives who are Republicans belong to the Republican Study Committee. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, used to be its president. The leadership of the House all belongs to it. Their budget for 2025 calls for dramatic cuts to Social Security, including raising the retirement age and cutting benefits, but not for people who are currently on Social Security, for people who are not there yet, because they know it would just kill them in terms of votes to say it to people who are already getting it, that they're in trouble. That was in March of this year. Now, if you remember, that's about when Biden gave his State of the Union address, and he called them out on it and said, you want to cut this stuff? And they went, no, we don't, because they know how unpopular that is. So in the Project 2025, it doesn't even mention Social Security. All right. But The Heritage Foundation, which is the primary author of Project 2025, just this month, no, what month are we in? August, in July, called for cuts to Social Security. So it's not in the 2025 document that I can find, but instead what they did is they had a separate document. Same people, not exactly the same people. Heritage Foundation, both. There are people who participated in 2025 that didn't participate in this other document. I think I didn't do a one-to-one. But when Trump and the Republicans came out with their platform, their party platform in July, they said in capital letters, we will not do anything to Social Security. We won't cut it. We won't or raise the age limits. Capital letters. By the way, the platform's a mess, but that's what it says. But it says nothing about protecting the solvency or anything like that. Then now Trump has called for ending taxes on Social Security, which were put in place by Reagan, ending federal taxes on Social Security. But those taxes only affect about 40% of the people who get Social Security, and those are people over a certain income level. And what that will do is it will add $1.6 to $1.8 trillion to the budget deficit over the next 10 years. So it certainly seems as if this is a way simply to get voters. At the same time, it will destroy Social Security. But people who say that 2025 does not call for cuts to Social Security may very well be right. I could not find a reference to Social Security. That's not true. There are some references to Social Security, but there are references to the way state funding could be adjusted in other fields that are covered by Social Security. But that's just a really interesting example of a place where what you are seeing is people saying, oh, Harris is lying. It's not in there. Well, she didn't actually say it's in Project 2025. She certainly made it sound as if it were, because she talks about Project 2025 and then she talks about Social Security. But I look at that as somebody who studies this and I say, Biden and the Democrats have been fighting to protect Social Security all along. They have called for higher taxes on individuals who make more than $400,000 a year to keep it solvent. They have vowed repeatedly that they will not permit Republicans to cut it. On the one hand, on the other, and by the way, the governor Walz cut state taxes on Social Security virtually for everybody in his state, and that doesn't hurt its solvency at all. It's not the same thing. That's another comparison people are making. Well, the Republicans, it certainly seems to me to be a sleight of hand to have called in March for cuts and then to have left it out of this dramatic document. After, to me, that just seems like a place where rather than just saying it's not in the document, it needs some analysis that it didn't feel to me like was out there. I don't know if that's of interest. I thought that was actually quite interesting how that played out. So that was another reference to places where journalists could be doing a lot more than they are in this moment to enable us to make good decisions about the future we choose, because, one of the things the Republicans keep saying is that they are protecting Social Security. And their argument is they are protecting it by making cuts to it that will enable it to stay solvent. And they have said that the Democrats are attacking Social Security by not making those cuts. So it cannot be solvent unless the Democrats raise taxes, which, that's fair. All right. So, a couple more things here that you asked about, because I started late, so I've got a little bit more time. Fact checking. Oh, you asked about, speaking of journalists, you asked about whether or not it's possible to fact check Trump in real time. And this is a real problem. Handling Trump is a real problem for journalists. And here's the problem. First of all, he should never have been allowed to get away with as much as he has. Second of all, he tends to give interviews only for people who refuse to fact check him and let him say whatever he wants. That's why his address to the National Association of Black Journalists was such a big deal the other day, is they did push back on him and they did quote his actual behavior to him. And he got so mad, he behaved so badly, his handlers grabbed him off the stage. So he's off the rails. And one of the problems with that, as somebody who tries to cover him, and as I say, I am not a journalist, but I feel their pain on this one. It's very hard to cover somebody who is that far from the norm, because it sounds like you're exaggerating or like you're being unfair. And one of the things that you see is a number of people clean up what he's saying because they're trying to make a point. They're trying to say, oh, this is what he said about Social Security or something. But that means you have to get rid of all the digressions and all the things that don't make sense and so on. And that is, that means there's just too much. It's kind of like a fire hose, and it makes it very, very hard to cover him. Now, that being said, the idea of trying to cover somebody who is a pathological liar is a real problem. That was weaponized first in the 1950s by Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, when he would just tell lies and people would cover it because it was news that he was, for example, accusing the State Department of harboring communists. And by the time that people checked it out, he was onto another lie. There's a wonderful biography of him by Richard Revere, who talks about how he had this there was always one lie. By the time you got to fact check a lie, there was already he'd already moved on to another lie. But that being said, yes, I think at this point it is no, we're beyond this point. Beginning years ago, they should have said they would not interview him unless he was on a time lag that could be fact checked. And if he didn't want the airtime, if he refused to do it under those conditions, then he should not have gotten the airtime. Because what he has done is he has normalized lying. He has normalized the big lie. He has undermined our justice system. He has undermined faith in democracy. He's a one-man wrecking ball. And we should not have to put up with that. Now, one of the things that you have asked about is how do you push back on that? And that is you support journalists and historians who tell the truth, and you demand it of all the news outlets to which you subscribe. So what does that mean? You pointed out, for example, the fact that we had an assassination attempt on a major public figure weeks ago, and it has fallen out of the news like a pebble in a pond, is bonkers. We never got a medical report on Trump's health, either his physical or his mental health. We got something handed out by Ronnie Jackson, which is, valueless. And we should continue to demand that stuff, because at this point, it just feels like Trump can do anything he wants. And that's such a huge disservice to us. But that brings up the final thing that you've asked about and that I wanted to talk about today, and that is Trump's mental health and his mental acuity, as he appears to be having trouble with his grasp of reality. And I think it's important not to sort of make this statement that, oh, he's old and therefore unfit. Because I know an awful lot of older people who are much more mentally astute than I am. Older than me, I mean, I'm not exactly a spring chicken, but I don't like that whole, if somebody is old, they should be pushed out the door. Because again, people who are crackerjack, terrific, and they're in their mid 80s, 90s, So I think that I'm trying to be careful the way I use language, because he's old, therefore, to me, is not okay. But it is very clear, if you watch old videos of him, or even videos of him in 2016, he has lost a lot of speed off his fastball, put it that way. and he does not seem to have a grip on reality any longer. He seems to believe the things he says about the election. He seems to believe the things he says about himself and his popularity. He does not seem to be a safe person in whom to deposit any kind of authority. And it certainly seems as if he is running for office primarily to avoid the many lawsuits against him. Remember, he declared very unusually early, as he did in 2020, by the way. And that partly is for financial reasons and when he can start using financial money, but it's also because it certainly seemed in 2024 like he thought that being a candidate for office might protect him from the lawsuits he was facing or the criminal cases he was facing. And remember, he has screamed again and again and again about how the lawsuits he is facing, the legal challenges he's facing, are election interference. That is not the case. In fact, it is. You can't start something late in the game, but you certainly can continue things. So that does bring up the question. I mean, it's very clear if you're watching, he's not campaigning. I mean, which is really unheard of in the modern era. And even in 2020 and 2016, he was out all over the place this time of year. And JD Vance is trying to take over. JD Vance does not have the personality to campaign. He's only got a year and a half experience in elected office at all. He's not good with the crowd. He is relatively charmless. And it's interesting that he is becoming the face of that campaign. Now, you asked what I thought was going to happen. Is Trump going to stay in at the top of the ticket? I game this stuff out a lot. This is kind of my happy place to think about the way things could play out. And I just don't see how the Republican Party moves him aside at this point. I don't. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I just don't see how it happens. But I think it is reasonable to expect that if Trump is reelected, that the person who will be doing the governing is Vance. I don't see Trump suddenly deciding to become a president. I think he's running to stay out of jail, and that the power will devolve to JD Vance and the people he surrounds himself with. And one of the things to be watching is the rise of discussions that we're having about cryptocurrency and the fact that the young Trumps and JD Vance and Peter Thiel and so on seem to be very interested in monetary policy and what that might look like. So, I don't know. It's going to be quite a ride for the next 80 some odd days, but I'm going to take that one under advisement because I'm as flummoxed as everybody else is by what's going on there. All right. So, somebody did point out, and this is true if you listen to his interview with Elon Musk last night, he was slurring his words terribly. And when asked about it, the campaign, using profanity, said to the person who asked to check their hearing because it was just fine. And it just wasn't. I mean, that's gaslighting for you. Anybody could hear it. Even me, and I tend not to hear that stuff very well. All right, so what do you do going forward? I think there's a couple of things we do going forward. The first is we lean into the joy of the potential of a new country that Harris and Walz have tapped into, the one that I've been talking about now for at least weeks, if not months, and don't let go of that, and yet still be aware that it's going to be a close election. And that the ballots matter up and down, state, local, as well as federal, and to get out there and make this our election, where we really make things turn around for this country. As I say, I think the reason that there is so much going on is because we're overturning not only the last, the Trump administration, but also the 40 years before it. And that means that a lot of people have to wrap their heads around a lot of new stuff. But if you are willing to lean into it and to bring your joy to the table and your skills to the table, it's kind of an amazing time to be alive and to be able to put our mark on it. So I'm going to let you go. I'm going to see if I can get out on the water before I go out. Just so you know, if you listen to me, or if you read me, Substack is gonna be offline tonight, so I'm gonna post early, and then uh, then I anyway will go dark, on Substack. So it's never happened before. I don't know quite what I'm gonna do with myself, but I guess we'll figure it out. Thank you for being here. I will see you next week.